My name is Emily Carter, and for as long as I can remember, my grandfather was the hero of every story I ever heard growing up. In our small Pennsylvania town, he was spoken of with reverence, a man who had served in the war with honor, and come home decorated with medals that shone like fragments of the sun. His framed photograph in uniform hung proudly above the fireplace in my parents' house, his stern but kind expression watching over every holiday, every birthday, every quiet evening when we gathered as a family. When I was a little girl, I used to climb onto his lap and beg him to tell me stories about the war. He never went into detail, never spoke of battles or blood, but he would smile faintly and say things like, "Courage doesn't always look the way you expect, Emily," or "The hardest battles are the ones you fight inside yourself." Those words etched themselves into my young heart, and I believed them without question. He was my idol, my example of what it meant to live with honor. Our family carried his legacy like a badge of pride. My father would point to his medals and say, "That's where we come from, Emily. That's our bloodline." My teachers in school, who had known him personally, would praise his discipline, his leadership, his sacrifices. To me, he was larger than life, the foundation upon which our family stood. Every summer, my grandmother would polish his medals and display them on the dining room table as if they were sacred relics. She spoke about him with a mixture of love and awe, always emphasizing his bravery, his loyalty, his sacrifices. "Your grandfather was the kind of man who put others before himself," she would say, her voice trembling with pride. As a child, I absorbed every word, never doubting, never questioning. I would tell my classmates that my grandfather had been a hero, and I meant it with all the certainty of a child's faith. To me, it was simple. He was a soldier, he fought for our country, and he returned home as a man of honor. But the truth is, even back then, there were cracks, tiny fractures in the polished glass of his reputation that I was too young to see. Sometimes, when I asked a question that dug too deeply, my grandmother would change the subject abruptly. My father, usually proud to boast about his father's achievements, would grow quiet and stern. And on rare occasions, when I caught my grandfather staring into the distance, his eyes were haunted, shadowed by something unspoken. I didn't understand those silences then. I thought all veterans carried burdens they couldn't share. I thought that was what made them heroes. Years later, after my grandfather passed away, I held on to the image I had always known. The hero, the warrior, the man of honor. It was easier than questioning it. It was safer to believe the myth than to face the unknown. But myths, I would learn, are fragile things. And sometimes, all it takes is one forgotten notebook, one hidden record, to shatter them completely. My grandfather passed away when I was 19. Just as I was starting college, his funeral was a somber, dignified affair. Veterans in uniform saluted his coffin. The American flag was folded with precision and handed to my grandmother. And the priest spoke of his service with unwavering reverence. I cried not only because I'd lost him, but because I felt as though I'd lost the last living symbol of honor in a world that often felt confusing and gray. For years after his death, I didn't question anything. My grandmother kept his belongings neatly stored in the attic, boxes labeled in her careful handwriting, uniforms, photos, letters, medals. Every holiday, when I came home from school, I would see those boxes stacked like sacred archives, never to be disturbed. My father treated them as untouchable, and my brother Michael didn't care enough to ask. It wasn't until my grandmother passed away almost 15 years later that those boxes found their way to me. The day after her funeral, my father called me into the attic. Dust hung thick in the air, sunlight slanted through the tiny window, and the boxes sat there just as I remembered them, though now they seemed heavier, as though time itself had pressed down upon them. My father sighed, rubbing his temples. "Emily, you were always closest to Mom. She wanted you to have these." I don't have the time to sort through it all. Take whatever you want. The rest, we'll put in storage. I hesitated. The idea of rifling through my grandparents' memories felt almost like trespassing. But I nodded, and one by one, I carried the boxes down into the living room. That night, after everyone had gone home, I opened the first box. Inside lay his medals, shining faintly even under the weak lamplight. The bronze star, the purple heart, ribbons of every color neatly pinned in rows. My fingers traced them slowly, reverently. This was the man I had idolized, the man who had shaped my idea of courage. The second box held photographs, sepia-toned snapshots of a young man in uniform smiling with his comrades, posing in front of tanks, leaning against sandbag walls with a cigarette dangling from his lips. I smiled through tears, feeling both close to him and impossibly far away. It was the third box that changed everything. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. Bundles of letters tied with twine, a few notebooks, and a battered leather-bound journal that looked older than anything else. My heart skipped when I saw my grandfather's handwriting scrawled across the front. Notes. I untied one bundle of letters. They were written to my grandmother during the war, affectionate, tender, but vague. He wrote about missing her, about the weather, about hoping to be home soon. But there was almost nothing about the war itself, nothing about what he had done or seen. That in itself wasn't unusual. Many soldiers avoided discussing the horrors they endured. Still, something about the way his words danced around the subject unsettled me. Finally, I opened the leather journal. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the writing was unmistakably his. At first, it seemed like ordinary notes, dates, times, places, mentions of supply runs and meetings. But then I noticed something odd. Certain names and phrases were underlined, circled, or marked with small crosses in the margins. One page stopped me cold. April 14, 1945. Deal made. Promises secured. Payment delivered. Hale satisfied. Silence required. I read the line over and over, my mind racing. Payment, deal, Hale. Who was Hale? And why would my grandfather use words like silence required in his private notes? I flipped further. More dates, more cryptic phrases. Meeting postponed. They don't trust me. Must convince them. Another. Frank questioned the orders. Remove the problem. Better this way. Remove the problem. I froze, my breath shallow. My grandfather had always spoken of honor, loyalty, sacrifice. Yet here, in his own handwriting, was language that sounded nothing like the man I had worshipped. It was clinical, cold. Not the words of a hero, but of someone hiding something. For the first time in my life, doubt crept in. What if the man I had built my entire image of strength upon was not who I thought he was? The journal lay heavy in my lap, a silent accusation against the myth I had been raised to believe. And though every instinct told me to close it, to put it back in the box and never look again, another voice whispered louder, "Keep reading." That night, as the wind rattled the attic window, I realized I was standing at the edge of a truth I might not be ready to face. But there was no turning back. The following morning, I woke up with the leather journal still on my nightstand, its cracked spine staring at me like an unspoken challenge. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, those phrases echoed in my mind. Payment delivered. Silence required. Remove the problem. They didn't sound like the words of a man recounting military duty. They sounded like codes, like something darker, something secret. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and forced myself to read the journal again, this time carefully, page by page. At first, it looked like scattered notes from the front lines, weather conditions, supply shortages, mentions of locations in Europe I had only seen in history books. But buried between the mundane entries were names, some familiar, some not. I recognized a few surnames as men my grandfather had supposedly served alongside. I remembered their faces from faded photographs in the family albums. But next to certain names, he had drawn symbols, a check mark, a cross, or sometimes just the word gone. I turned the page and froze. Meeting with Hale postponed. Concerns over loyalty. Frank doubts the plan. Must act before command discovers. There it was, again. Hale and Frank. Who was Hale? And what plan could have required such secrecy that even military command was to be kept in the dark? I searched through the letters he had written to my grandmother, hoping for context. But the letters were carefully constructed, filled with love, longing, and domestic details. He mentioned her baking, the garden, how much he missed her. But he never once mentioned Hale, never once mentioned Frank. It was as if those names belonged to a different life entirely, one he refused to share with his family. Determined, I began cross-referencing. I pulled out an old family photo album, flipping through black and white pictures of uniformed men. And then I saw it, a group shot of my grandfather with several comrades. At the bottom, written in his neat handwriting, were the names: Robert, Samuel, Thomas, and Frank. So Frank was real, a soldier, someone who had stood beside my grandfather in the war. But if Frank was real, then who was Hale? His name never appeared in any of the family archives, no photographs, no letters, nothing. The absence was glaring, like a shadow at the edge of every page. I went back to the journal. Another entry stood out: July 2nd, 1945. Payment delayed, Hale restless. Frank raising too many questions. Must silence him soon. My stomach twisted. Must silence him soon. The words weren't vague anymore. They were chilling, deliberate. The thought struck me like a lightning bolt. What if my grandfather hadn't been the loyal comrade everyone believed? What if Frank's questions had cost him his life? I slammed the journal shut, suddenly nauseous. But then another thought crept in, darker still. If Hale wasn't a soldier, then who was he? A black market dealer? A collaborator? Someone pulling strings in the shadows of the war while men like my grandfather did his bidding? I couldn't stop myself. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the local library, digging through old military records. The archivist, a kind older woman, helped me search digital databases and microfilm newspapers. Hours passed, but I found almost nothing. No official record of anyone named Hale connected to my grandfather's unit. No mention of unusual deals or internal conflicts. Just standard reports of missions, deployments, and casualty lists. But one thing did stand out. Frank's name was there, in the casualty records. He had died in 1945, listed as killed in action. No details, no explanation. Just a single line in a long list of the dead. I stared at the paper, the words blurring. My grandfather had written, "Must silence him soon," just weeks before Frank's official date of death. Coincidence or confession? On the way home, I couldn't shake the unease coiling in my chest. I kept replaying every memory of my grandfather, his smiles, his advice, his silences. Had I mistaken those haunted eyes for wisdom, when in truth they carried guilt? Had I built my entire childhood around a lie? When I got back to the house, the journal was still waiting on the table. I opened it again, flipping to the last pages. The final entry was brief, written in a hurried scrawl. August 9th, 1945. Mission complete, Hale satisfied. Records hidden, truth buried. Truth buried. I sat there in silence, the weight of those words pressing down on me. Somewhere, hidden among these papers, was a truth my grandfather had never wanted anyone to uncover. A truth that had been buried for decades. Until now. And I couldn't escape the gnawing certainty that digging deeper might not only change how I saw him, but also put me in danger. Because if Hale's influence had reached into the war itself, who was to say it hadn't reached beyond it? For days, I carried the weight of that journal like a stone in my chest. Every time I passed by the living room where the boxes sat, I felt its presence. like it was watching me, daring me to keep reading. The entries about Hale, about Frank, about silencing and burying the truth replayed in my head until I thought I would lose my mind. I knew I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. The questions were too big, too heavy. I needed answers. And the only people who might know more than I did were my own family. One evening, I invited my father and my older brother Michael over to the house. I set the journal on the dining room table between us, the cracked leather glowing under the warm light of the chandelier. My father eyed it with a mixture of nostalgia and unease, while Michael leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, already skeptical. "What's this about?" Michael asked. "You sounded urgent on the phone." I pushed the journal toward them. "It's grandfather's. I found it in one of the boxes Grandma left me. You both need to see what's inside." My father hesitated before flipping it open. His hands shook as he turned the pages, scanning the words. His brow furrowed deeper with each line. Michael leaned over his shoulder, reading silently, his expression turning from boredom to confusion to anger. Finally, Michael slammed the journal shut. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "Old men wrote strange things in their notebooks all the time. You're overreacting." I shook my head fiercely. "No, this isn't nonsense. Look at the dates, the names. Frank died right after Grandfather wrote about silencing him. And who is Hale? Why does his name appear over and over? These aren't random notes. These are records." My father rubbed his temples, his face pale. "Emily, some things are better left in the past. Your grandfather was a complicated man. He did what he thought was right during a very difficult time. We don't need to drag all this up again." I stared at him, stunned. "You knew." He looked away, but the silence was answer enough. Michael slammed his fist against the table. "Stop it, Emily. You're making something out of nothing. You're going to destroy his reputation, our reputation, over scribbles in a notebook." "Reputation?" I shot back, my voice trembling. "What about the truth? What about the lives tied to these words? Frank was real. He died. And Grandfather wrote about silencing him. Don't you want to know what that means?" Michael's eyes flashed with anger. "No, I don't. And neither should you. Drop it. Burn the damn thing if you have to, but stop digging." My father finally spoke, his voice heavy, almost broken. "Your grandfather wasn't perfect, Emily. He made choices. Choices I didn't always agree with. But he was still family. He raised us. He provided for us. He taught us discipline. Isn't that enough?" I felt tears sting my eyes. "No, Dad, it's not enough. I grew up believing he was a hero. I built my life around that image. If it's a lie, I deserve to know. We all deserve to know." Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "You don't know what you're getting into. There are things in that book that could ruin us if the wrong people see them. Do you understand? This isn't just about family. It's bigger than that." His words sent a chill through me. The wrong people. He sounded less like a brother and more like a man protecting something. Or someone. I looked between them, my father pale and silent, my brother flushed with anger, and I realized they weren't just resisting because of pride. They were afraid. Afraid of what I might uncover. That night, after they left, I sat alone at the dining table with the journal in front of me. The air felt heavier than ever, the house too quiet. I traced the faded ink with my fingers, my mind racing with questions. What exactly did my family know? How long had they been protecting this secret? And why did the name Hale still send shivers down my spine? As though it belonged not to a man of the past, but to a shadow that still lingered in the present. For the first time, I wondered if my grandfather's sins hadn't died with him. Maybe they were still alive, still dangerous. And maybe, by opening this journal, I had just invited them back into my life. The night after the argument with my father and Michael, I couldn't sleep. Their words echoed in my mind. Michael's anger, my father's evasive silence. Both of them wanted me to drop it, to leave the past buried. But instead of convincing me, their reactions only fueled my determination. If they were that scared of the truth, then the truth had to matter. At 3 in the morning, I found myself back at the kitchen table. The journal spread open in front of me, my laptop glowed beside it, the cursor blinking in an empty search bar. I typed in the name that haunted the pages, Franklin Hale. Dozens of results popped up, most irrelevant, businessmen, politicians, even a novelist. But one entry caught my eye, a Franklin P. Hale listed in a declassified World War II intelligence file. My pulse quickened. I clicked the link and a grainy scanned document appeared, stamped with the word confidential in faded ink. The text was partially redacted, whole sentences blacked out, but the fragments I could read chilled me. Hale, suspected of collaboration, black market dealings in occupied territories, subject engaged with U.S. servicemen for supply exchange, further investigation compromised. I sat back, my heart racing. Collaboration, black market dealings. That was the missing puzzle piece. Hale hadn't been a soldier at all. He had been a shadow figure, moving goods, money, and influence during the chaos of war. And my grandfather had been working with him. I flipped back to the journal, aligning the dates, supplies, meetings, payments. It all matched. My grandfather wasn't just writing about military duties. He was recording secret transactions with Hale. But one question gnawed at me. Why Frank? Why was his name singled out? Why had my grandfather written, "removed the problem," right before Frank's death? I spent the next day at the county library, sifting through old newspapers on microfilm. Hours blurred together until finally, a headline from August 1945 caught my eye. Local hero dies in combat overseas. Sergeant Frank Miller, remembered for his loyalty and bravery. The obituary was short, almost perfunctory. It mentioned his unit, his surviving family, and his heroic sacrifice, but something about it felt incomplete. No details of the battle, no description of how he died, just a line. Circumstances of his death remain classified. Classified. That word burned in my mind. I photocopied the article and stuffed it into my bag. On the way out, I nearly bumped into a man in the hallway. He was tall, gray-haired, dressed in a dark suit that seemed out of place in the dusty library. For a moment, our eyes met. He gave me a polite nod, but something about the way he looked at me, sharp, assessing, made my stomach clench. I brushed it off as paranoia, but when I walked outside, I saw him again. He was leaning against a black sedan across the street, smoking a cigarette. He watched me for a few seconds before getting into the car and driving away. That night, I spread the journal, the obituary, and the declassified file across my desk. The pieces were aligning into something darker than I had ever imagined. My grandfather had worked with Hale, a man suspected of collaboration and black market corruption. Frank Miller had questioned something. Maybe the deals, maybe Hale himself. And days later, he was dead. And now, decades later, someone was still watching. For the first time, I felt a cold certainty settle into my bones. This wasn't just family history. This wasn't just about my grandfather's past. The shadows of his choices were still alive, still moving, still dangerous. And by opening the journal, by digging into these secrets, I had just stepped into their path. The following morning began like any other, but the unease from the library lingered with me. I couldn't shake the image of the gray-haired man in the dark suit, the way he had studied me like a problem that needed solving. It wasn't just curiosity, it felt like surveillance. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe he was just another researcher. Maybe I was letting paranoia creep in. But when I stepped onto my porch to grab the morning paper, my blood ran cold. There, tucked under the doormat, was an envelope. Plain, unmarked. My name scrawled in block letters across the front. Emily. My hands trembled as I ripped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, stark and menacing in its simplicity. 4 words, typed in bold black letters. Stop looking, stay silent. My knees buckled, and I had to grab the door frame to steady myself. The warning was direct, deliberate. Someone knew exactly what I'd been doing, searching records, copying obituaries, digging through my grandfather's past, and they wanted me to stop. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My mind raced. Who had left the note? The man from the library? Someone connected to Hale's network? The thought chilled me. If Hale had been powerful enough to survive in the chaos of war, maybe his influence hadn't disappeared at all. Maybe it had only gone underground. I called my brother Michael. When he picked up, his voice was sharp, impatient. Emily, what now? They know, I whispered, clutching the note in my hand. Someone's watching me. They left a warning at my door. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Michael said, I told you this would happen. You've stirred up things you don't understand. You need to stop before it's too late. You knew, didn't you? I snapped. You knew there were people who still cared about what grandfather did. That's why you wanted me to stay quiet. His sigh was heavy, resigned. Some truths aren't meant to come out, Emily. They'll destroy everything. I hung up, my heart pounding. I couldn't tell if he was trying to protect me or protect himself. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, the journal open on my lap, watching the empty street outside. Midnight came and went. The house was silent except for the ticking clock in the kitchen. And then, around 2 a.m., headlights swept across the window. A black sedan rolled slowly down the street, its engine humming softly. It stopped in front of my house, idled for a moment, then eased forward and disappeared around the corner. I didn't breathe until the sound of the engine faded completely. The next morning, I found another note, this time pinned to my front door with a knife. My heart lurched as I pulled it free. The message was shorter, crueler. You were warned. The knife was old, military style, its handle worn smooth. A relic just like the journal. A message that wasn't just about intimidation. It was personal. Fear surged through me, hot and suffocating. But beneath it, something else stirred. Anger, defiance. I whispered into the quiet house, my voice trembling but steady. You can threaten me all you want, but I won't stop. Because by now, it was too late. The truth wasn't just my grandfather's secret anymore. It was mine. The threats should have broken me. For 2 nights, I barely slept, listening to every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind outside the window. I kept the journal locked in a desk drawer, but that didn't ease the weight pressing down on my chest. Whoever had left those notes wanted me to feel hunted, and it was working. But fear has a strange way of transforming when it collides with anger. And anger was beginning to take root in me, stronger with each passing day. Why should I stay silent? Just because someone demanded it? Why should I let men like Hale, or whoever still served his memory, decide what truths could be spoken and which must remain buried? I decided to fight back. The first step was to gather everything I had, every scrap of evidence. I laid it out on the dining room table, the journal, the declassified file, the photocopied obituary, the threatening notes. Side by side, they formed a mosaic of shadows stretching across decades. It wasn't enough to prove a case, but it was enough to tell a story. Still, I needed help. I couldn't carry this alone. I thought of Frank Miller's family, the sergeant my grandfather might have betrayed. A quick search led me to an address. His granddaughter, Claire Miller, still lived in town, just a few miles away. My heart pounded as I drove there. The journal locked in the passenger seat beside me. Claire answered the door cautiously. A woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back tightly. Her eyes narrowed when I introduced myself. Carter, she repeated, the name heavy with recognition. As in Robert Carter's granddaughter? I nodded. Yes. And I think I think you deserve to see something." She hesitated, then led me inside. Her house was modest, filled with family photographs and worn furniture. On the mantel sat a framed portrait of a young soldier, Frank Miller. His eyes were warm, kind, so alive it made my chest ache. I handed her the photocopied obituary first. She brushed it aside bitterly. "We've had that clipping for decades. It tells us nothing." Then I placed the journal in her hands. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, her fingers trembling as they traced the cracked leather. Slowly, she opened it and began to read. Her lips parted as she reached the pages mentioning Frank. When she came to the words, "removed the problem," her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Tears welled in her eyes. This can't be," she whispered. "All these years we thought it was the war. We thought it was bad luck, a stray bullet. And now—" I leaned forward, my voice steady but low. "Claire, I think my grandfather was involved in something bigger, something connected to a man named Hale. I don't know all the details yet, but your grandfather may have been silenced because he questioned it." She closed the journal gently, her shoulders shaking. "We always knew something wasn't right. My grandmother used to say Frank had written letters home, letters that disappeared after he died. She believed someone destroyed them." Her words sent chills down my spine. "Do you still have any of his belongings?" Claire nodded slowly. "A trunk in the attic. I never opened it. Too painful." With her permission, we climbed up the narrow stairs to the attic. Dust swirled in the air as she pulled an old trunk from the corner. The lock was rusted, but it gave way under pressure. Inside were uniforms, medals, and a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. I untied them carefully. Most were ordinary, expressions of love, descriptions of camp life, but one stood out. The handwriting was hurried, urgent. "If anything happens to me, it won't be the enemy. It will be Hale, and Robert knows. Tell someone. Don't let this disappear." My breath caught. There it was. Proof. Claire's hands shook as she read it, tears streaming down her face. All these years, and no one listened. I placed a hand over hers. "We'll make them listen." But even as I said it, I felt the weight of unseen eyes. Because if I had found this letter, if Claire and I were piecing the truth together, then surely the people who left those warnings knew I wouldn't stop. And if the past had already cost Frank Miller his life, what would it cost me to expose it now? That night, after leaving Claire's house, I drove home with the letter clutched tightly in my bag. The words burned in my mind. If anything happens to me, it won't be the enemy. It will be Hale. And Robert knows. My grandfather's name. Written by the man who had once called him a comrade, perhaps even a friend. The road back felt endless. The dark trees pressing close on either side. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror made my stomach twist. Twice, I thought I was being followed. A black sedan that lingered behind me, never too close, never far. When I finally pulled onto my street, the car slowed but didn't turn in. It rolled past my house and vanished into the night. I locked every door, drew every curtain, and spread the evidence out on my dining table. The journal, the obituary, the warning notes. And now, Frank Miller's desperate letter. Together, they formed a story so damning it made me tremble. My grandfather, Robert Carter, had not only collaborated with a man named Hale, but may have actively betrayed his own brothers in arms. But there was no time to grieve the image of the man I thought I knew, because now the past was colliding with the present, and whoever had inherited Hale's secrets wasn't going to let me dig deeper. It started with the phone calls. The first one came just after midnight. I answered without thinking, my voice hoarse from exhaustion. Silence on the other end. Then a faint click, like someone hanging up. The second call came an hour later. Same silence, same click. By the third call, I was shaking. "Who is this?" I shouted into the receiver. "What do you want from me?" This time, there was an answer. A man's voice, low and gravelly. "Stop looking, Emily, or you'll end up like Frank." The line went dead. I dropped the phone, my hands numb, my heart racing so fast I thought I might collapse. They knew exactly what I had found at Claire's house. They knew about the letter, and they were warning me, just as they had warned Frank. Sleep was impossible. I sat by the window all night, watching the street below. At 3 a.m., I saw it again. The black sedan, parked half a block away, its headlights off, engine idling softly. I watched it for what felt like hours, until finally it pulled away. By morning, exhaustion pressed down on me, but I couldn't stop. If they wanted me silent, then the truth had to be louder than ever. I drove back to Claire's house to show her what had happened. But when I pulled up, the front door was ajar. My stomach dropped. Inside, the living room was in disarray. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor. "Claire?" I called, my voice echoing in the silence. No answer. My pulse thundered in my ears as I climbed the stairs, half expecting to find something terrible. But Claire was there, in the attic, her face pale, clutching the trunk of her grandfather's belongings. "They were here," she whispered, her voice shaking. I heard them downstairs. By the time I came up, they were gone. They took the letters. I rushed to her side. The bundle of letters we had opened last night was gone, every last page, except for one. The urgent letter from Frank, the one that had named Hale and my grandfather. Claire must have clutched it in her hands when the intruders came. It was the only thing left. I helped her downstairs, my mind spinning. Whoever they were fast, efficient, and fearless enough to break into Claire's home in the middle of the night. And they knew exactly what to take. "They'll come after you next," Claire whispered, gripping my arm. "You have to stop, Emily. Please. If they could kill Frank, if they could silence all of this for decades, do you really think they won't silence us too?" Her fear was contagious, wrapping itself around my chest like chains. But even as my hands shook, even as the enormity of what I was facing pressed down on me, I felt a fire ignite inside. "They've already come after me," I said quietly, "and I'm still here." As I left her house, the black sedan was waiting at the end of the street. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, refusing to look away as I drove past. Inside, two men in suits stared straight ahead.